Lucas es, bueno, es un doctor en ciencia política, recientemente graduado de la Universidad de Berkeley, donde escribió una tesis sobre clientelismo en Brasil. Tengo entendido que además Lucas está trabajando en convertir su tesis en un libro, y parte de su tesis está publicada en un paper que le recomiendo a todo el mundo leer, o al menos a todos los que están interesados en clientelismo, en el American Journal of Political Science, donde además el otro día nos enteramos que es uno de los papers más citados del American Journal of Political Science de los últimos años. Lucas es economista en su formación de grado bueno, y tiene intereses bastante diversos, aunque sí siempre trabajando todos los temas desde un punto con datos y con mucha rigurosidad analítica, y bueno, y especialmente con un foco en lo que tiene que ver con la inferencia causal y la estimación de efectos causales. Así que bueno, nada, estamos muy contentos que aceptó la invitación para presentar su trabajo, que además no podría ser de un tema más relevante, que es bueno, la violencia y las políticas de mano dura en Brasil. Así que bueno, gracias, Lucas.
No, gracias a vos, Herman, y no sé si Roberto está acá también, pero lo agradezco también. Y voy a cambiar para inglés, pero no. And well, I'm really glad to be here, and it's unfortunate that I'm not there with you guys, but this is the second best, and I'm really happy that I'm able to present this project that I've been working the past couple of years. And well, this project tangents a topic that has becoming very important, not only in Latin America, I guess, but actually in the whole democratic world. And it is how the police and politics intersect with each other. And I guess, well, right now in Argentina, we have a very good example of that with the recent standoff between the president and the police, right? And I think this fits into a larger picture of how the police can be thought as an interest group, and how police and politics can generate some outcomes that we yet don't know very well how they might come about. Right? And this relationship between politics and police, it's also something that is very in evidence right now in Brazil, right? Because the police departments, they all seem very eager to show some admiration and even loyalty to Jair Bolsonaro. And this loyalty is somehow worrisome for a number of reasons. First, the police in Brazil, they are, in the hierarchy, they're under the state governor's command. And this seems that they are leaning towards Bolsonaro, and there seems some instances where Bolsonaro tried to politicize their relationship with the police. And I guess most of these clashes have been triggered by coronavirus, but it seems that they also, Bolsonaro has been using this politically, and to some extent with some success. But I guess what worries me the most is that right now, if we believe in the story that there is some democratic erosion in Brazil, and I don't want to get into that because this is not the topic, but if we believe in that, my sense is that it's not the army that is going to cross the Rubicon. It's mostly likely that it's going to be the police departments, and they seem to be very autonomous right now and somehow more politicized. Okay, so this is overall the picture that I'm starting the talk. Since this is an online forum, I prefer that if you have anything you want to ask me, either clarification or even a substantive question, you can ask me right away, and I'll pause the presentation to answer it. Otherwise, I'll also be happy to answer any questions you might have at the end of the presentation. Okay. So my talk today is about how mixing up law enforcement with politics can generate violent outcomes. Okay. And this is not very surprising. We have seen some examples in the past that have pointed toward this direction. We have a great deal of evidence that law and order politics can either generate more violence, as it was the case in Mexico recently. As some of you might know, that there's when Calderon, well, in 2006, if I don't forget, he was elected in a law and order program, and immediately after he took office, he unleashed a crackdown over the cartels that it was disastrous in a lot of aspects, because that really skyrocketed, that created so much violence that it skyrocketed to levels that I had never seen before in Mexico. And there are some other examples in Central America and the Philippines where law and order and politics create more violence. And not only more violence, but also mano dura politics that can actually threaten civil liberties. And in Brazil, despite all these evidence that law and order politics creates more violence, we see an ever-growing number of police officers that run for office. And these are mostly the guys that, I mean, these are just a snapshot of some of them. And we see that they all try very hard to showcase that they're committed to combat violence, well, not combat violence, but go against crime, actually. We see that they have all these, well, sometimes they look tough. Like, do you guys can see my mouse pointer? Just so.
Yes.
Yes, we see.
Okay. So, like these guys, they all feel very clearly inclined towards showing that they're tough, or more importantly for this project, they make it very clear that they come from either the police or the army. So they know the voters, they know exactly what they're up to, okay? And what I want to know in this project is what happens when one of these guys are elected. What is the effect of electing one of these guys on either crime or violence, okay? It seems that so the question that I'm trying to answer is, what are the effects of electing one of these candidates on public security? So I look at what happens with crime, what happens with violence. And on the background, what I'm actually asking is, does more substantive representation of public security leads to better public security outcomes? So in a nutshell, what I do is I go, well, I don't go to Brazil, I'm in Brazil, but I focus on Brazilian politics, who explicitly mobilize voters with law and order promises. And these guys, they propagandize their issue ownership, so to speak, through the ballot names they use. So they make very clear for the voter that, like, they're Sergeant X or Sheriff Y and stuff like that. So people know that they come from law enforcement. And which is something quite novel, well, not novel, but perhaps not very common, because in Brazil and elsewhere, it's really rare for politicians to run a program, but apparently they do. And more strikingly, I look at the lowest level possible in Brazil, which is local legislators. And they, on theory, they can't do much. So we shouldn't expect that they could actually affect local. So they can't do much on paper, but I try to see if they can actually bring about some changes in public security. And specifically, although they can't do much, since some of them are actual police officers and they maintain relationship with the police departments in their municipalities, maybe informally they can change how the police place resources within the municipality for better or worse. And to answer these questions and to try to understand better what they do, I employ a regression discontinuity design and also do a spatial analysis of where crime is committed in a municipality. So overview of the results. What I find is that when a municipality elects one of these candidates, there is a modest reduction in crime. But at the same time, there is a doubling of homicides. So there's much more violence when one of these guys win the election. And if I look at the profile of victims, what I find is that homicides increase only among non-white. These results only appear in municipalities that elected a law enforcement candidate that comes from the police and not from the army. And when I try to argue and try to convince you is that there's some suggestive evidence that it's actual political favoritism that drives these results, and political favoritism in the form of these police officers, when they win, they're going to try to reallocate resources within the municipality to favor their constituency and to and indirectly remove resources from constituencies that didn't vote for them. And here, what we can see is that this is a time series that shows the daily homicides for 4 different groups of the Brazilian society. And in Brazil, roughly each of these lines represent a quarter of the population. And we can see that if violence has been increasing in Brazil, and it had in previous years, now it seems that it is plateauing or even reducing. But if we look at this line, we see that most of these new violence is only because there's an increase of violence among non-white men. There is no noticeable increase on any other group. And the puzzling part is that who votes for the law and order candidates? It's not non-white men. What I see is that mostly the constituency that votes for law enforcement candidates are white people, or actually what I find is that they are usually wealthier. And being non-white in Brazil maps well in lower income. So basically what I read is that lower income, they don't vote usually for law enforcement candidates. And who votes for them is usually the wealthier constituency. And because there is this political favoritism, when one of these law enforcement candidates win, they remove resources from those that are actually more vulnerable to violence towards the wealthier constituency. And when they do that, violence increases. Okay.
I'm sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
When you say crime among non-white men, do you mean non-white men are the ones that are killed, or is it between like non-white people?
So here I'm only looking at homicides. So this is actual violence. And all that I have, I don't have the details of the homicide other than the details of the victim. So I don't know who are killing them, but I'm going to show that it's not going to be the police. So, okay, so now let me talk a little bit about the details that I'm talking about. So I'm going to be looking at armed forces personnel, police officers that run for office, retired armed forces or on leave. And as I mentioned, programmatic campaigning in Brazil is very rare, actually in the whole developing world. But these guys, they have a very, they have a clear advantage on that because they can somehow signal commitment and expertise in the provision of security. If that will translate in better public security as politicians or as policymakers, that's another issue. But they do try to say that for voters that they're gonna act on public security. And but we don't know exactly what will happen when these guys win, right? What we know about the police is that in Latin America and elsewhere is that they're usually very corrupt. They're not very prepared to deal with democratic politics, and they are brutal. They are sometimes not. They don't have any checks and balances that would lead to prosecutions or lead to expulsion and all that. On the contrary, what we see is that police officers that transgress the law, they're sometimes even rewarded by the corporation. And they actually, there's an institutional path dependency that, at least in Brazil, and I believe also in Argentina at some point, that they seem they were the enforcers of authoritarian regimes, and they seem to have these brutal tactics still ingrained in their institutions. It's really hard to reform the police. I think Hernan Flon has had a really nice work on that, both in Brazil and Argentina. And as I also mentioned in the introduction, we also see that when these law and order policies are implemented, what we have is that they can go very, very wrong, as it happens in Mexico, Guatemala, or Honduras, Colombia, and it seems that actually fighting against these large drug trafficking organizations can backfire tremendously. But there's still a lot we don't know. And this is what I try to insert my project in, is that most studies will be looking at how law and order and politics affect the relationship between the state and drug trafficking organizations. But in most places, we still see very violent outcomes, even when there's no drug trafficking organizations. In Brazil, most work on violence focus on Rio or São Paulo, and we know very little what happens in the countryside. We know very little what happens in medium-sized municipalities. They're way out of the roots of drug traffickers. And as the time series that I showed you before, violence is very asymmetrical, so it's very unclear what is going to happen with specific subgroups of the society. And also what I know is that, and I'm going to show you, is that the constituencies, those that vote for law and order, are also very asymmetrical. We see that there's this very specific group of people, not only I'm going to show here, but it's a very established result in the literature, that usually there's a relatively wealthier people vote for law and order. So what could go wrong? So what I contend is that politicians can give precedence in the way that they dispose resources in the society to their supporters. and this is common to most public policy. And specifically in the domain of public security, this favoritism can be very, it can go wrong. Specifically because if we imagine that one marginal police officer on the street close to a synagogue, this police officer probably will reduce crime in the surroundings, but not necessarily will reduce crime on the blocks farther away. Actually, what we know is that there is no reduction in crime, but only there's going to be a spillover. So basically, there's going to be a relocation of crime from other areas. And if we're talking about what I'm suggesting is that when a law enforcement candidate wins, what we will see is that these law enforcement candidates will relocate resources from poor to richer areas of the municipality. We're going to also see that those areas that are more likely to have violence and more likely to have vulnerable people to violence, especially lower income, younger male, we will probably see that this political favoritism will overall increase the number of violent deaths. Obviously, there are some scope conditions to what I'm trying to claim here, especially as I mentioned, the politicians that I'm going to be looking at, they have very few resources on their disposal. It's really hard to, even if you have a lot of resources, it's really hard to make tremendous changes in crime and violence because, well, it all like long trends of decline in violence. It has to do with demographics. It has to do with consistent growth in the country or more education, higher educational levels, and so on. And for local politicians, this is really out of the table. They have no chance on making relevant changes on these, even some structural variables, right? And also, even if they wanted to make changes on those fronts, they don't have the autonomy to do so because public security policy often has to go through different layers of the institutional arrangement that govern that public policy, public security. So, for example, in Brazil, they usually are on the state level, and the state level also has to address to different constitutional arrangements that they don't have a lot of leeway. What I looking at this problem a little bit further, talking to some people and some anecdotal evidence that I find is that they can some of these law enforcement candidates can informally affect how resources are employed at the local level, because most decisions on, for example, where to put a squad car, where to patrol the streets, and all that are done at the local level. And I don't know, I would love to hear about it from you guys, but in Brazil, like if you go around the residential upper class, middle upper class in São Paulo areas, you're going to see a lot of signs that what do you say, vizinhança solidária or vizinhança vigilante. So basically is that these middle upper class neighborhoods, they have associations, they have a direct link with the police, and that will lead to a lot of, I don't know, police patrols in these neighborhoods. You see that police, when they cruise around these neighborhoods. They're all like, oh, hello, they're all nice. Or they also go to some commercial thoroughfares. But you're going to see a lot of squad cars stopping on bakeries or coffee shops to have their coffee, and they're going to say hi to everyone, to the owner. They're going to get their you know, some refreshment and all that. And there's a lot of small details that go into local policing that can be affected if you have the connection to the police. And of these law and enforcement officers that I'm going to look at, I think that the Army will not have a lot of ability to influence local policing. But on the other hand, police officers that win office, they still have very strong connections to the police, and they will know the captain, the chief battalion, and all that, and they will have ways to influence the police at the local level. So in Brazil, I'm going to be looking at law enforcement candidates that are council candidates. So this is the lowest level of politics in Brazil, in many ways. And they are elected through proportional representation, which I explore a bit under my regression discontinuity design. Usually they run a clientelistic campaigning, and they have almost no programmatic appeal. As I mentioned, state government control police resources, but organization and strategy is local. And for most cities, we don't have organized crime. We do have local gangs, obviously, but it's not that we see the PCC or the Comando Vermelho on the corners of the state of Goiás, for example. There are some incursions recently, and but for most of the period that I analyze, we shouldn't be picturing that these medium to small municipalities that I'm going to be analyzing have organized crime. So there's this recent Magaloni and others papers looking at a crime in Rio, and they claim that there are some places where it's anarchic. There's no well, if we go to, let's say that the roving bandit is still there. So what can these local councilors or what vereadores is what we call them, do while in office? They can try to make the mayor install more CCTV cameras. They can create sometimes municipal guards. They sometimes hire private security. They do this very often, is that they create audiences and town hall meetings where they put the people and the police together. But still they're very constrained in terms of resources. And unless they have some backdoor channel, it's very hard that they will be able to effectively change public security at the local level. The data that I look, so now moving a little bit into the empirical part, I look at electoral data in Brazil, public spending, crime statistics, and violence. And I guess some of you might be familiar with it, and I guess the specifically for this project, what I think it was the most interesting data set is the one that catalogs all homicides in Brazil, which is cataloged by the Ministry of Health. And so every single violent or death is recorded that, and I can separate what really caused this death. And for the state of São Paulo, as we will see, I can actually get the address of the homicide. So basically every dead person is accounted for. So I look over 1.8 million deaths since 2000 for this project. I can have, I gather information about the gender, age, race, and occupation of all the victims. So I have only information about the victims, not actually the event. And some coroner or some doctor has to rule whether the death occurred to an accident, suicide, and homicide. And what we see is that all deaths caused to external causes of injury, we see that there is this peak here that is mostly due to assault or to be caused by someone. And then we have suicides and undetermined. Okay. And the candidates that I looked, so basically this is a snapshot of my data set. And we see that each candidate, so here is the list of the full name of each candidate, they have to place a ballot name, which is called urna name. And the urna name, specifically for this subgroup, you can see that most of them have some indication that they work for law enforcement. So we have a colonel or delegado, which is sheriff, a sergeant, and so on and so on. But you can see that some of them are from the police force, but they don't have a ballot name that reminds people that they are from law enforcement. So what I do is, I gather these names that have some connotation to law enforcement, and I annotate them as law enforcement candidates. Just one detail here, like some what we call delegados, they are called a doutor something, because some people, people like to be differential. So, but if I match the name with the employment that they self-report when they're filling their candidacy application, I can register them as law enforcement candidates. And you see that some are military, some are police militar, which is a patrolling police, and police civil, which is a plainclothes police. And who are they? So basically, this is just a small sample of them, and you can see that they are very clear that there's security, they they're gonna get rid of drugs in the municipality, vote for security, or this guy is all in his military garb. So they are very clear that they want to show off their background as police officers or law enforcement. What I'm gonna be looking though, it's only municipalities that had one of these candidates. And municipalities, well, not all municipalities have these candidates, and those that have are probably very different from the municipalities that didn't have one. And here is just to give you an idea that the municipalities that had a law enforcement candidate and those that did not, they're similar on a lot of dimensions, but those that had are usually larger, right? They are somewhat more, they are wealthier, and they're much more violent, right? But we're gonna be only looking at these municipalities, those that had a law enforcement candidate. Okay, so now let's go to the regression discontinuity design. And I'm gonna do is, well, first, there are a lot of empirical challenges if I'm gonna study law enforcement candidates, because, well, having a law enforcement candidate and having more violence could only mean that as you have more policing in some place and more violence, it's just there's a reverse causation here. So to get rid of that, what I do is I employ a regression discontinuity design. And the regression discontinuity design basically has a group that is the treatment group, And the treatment group here are municipalities with a winning law enforcement candidates, and a control group municipalities with a losing law enforcement candidate. And what makes one municipality go to the treatment and control group is determined by whether they, well, by a running variable. Basically, what I do is I'm going to be looking only. I can go, like the technical detail for the PR regression discontinuities. I'll be happy to discuss further, and I have been implementing a different type of running variable, but just to no, it's Friday night, so I don't want to be very long on this technical detail, but basically I'm going to be looking at municipalities that almost won, municipalities that almost elected a law enforcement candidate for a very small margin, and municipalities that almost did not elect a law enforcement candidate. And the logic behind this procedure of looking at very close elections, I guess some of you had classes with Herman already, so you're all very well educated on it. But it's to kind of mimic a procedure where treatment and control are given randomly. And the model that I use is going to be, I'm going to use the difference between the outcome after the law enforcement, after the election minus the outcome before the election. And the parameter that I'm interested in estimating is the beta here, which is the effect of electing a law enforcement candidate. And just to give you a glimpse of what how I construct my independent variable. So imagine that I'm looking at municipalities that had elected a law enforcement candidate in the 2004 election. I'm going to be collecting let's say the homicides that happened between 2005 and 2008. So I drop the electoral year because in the electoral year we might have some contamination. And I take the difference from the same period before the election, okay? For those that are keen on doing RDD, these are the balance tests. So on different dimensions, we see that the potential outcomes do not seem to be very different from, it indicates that the potential outcomes between treatment and control are very similar. There is no imbalance on these covariates that I was able to collect. And also there is no jump in the density. So, okay, so the main results. First, I'm going to start with the result that...
Lucas, just a clarification question. So we're going to be comparing municipalities that have no vereadores with a law enforcement background no. With municipalities that have at least one vereador with
yes. I'm going to be looking at only municipalities that had a law enforcement candidate, but I'm going to be comparing those that didn't elect a law enforcement candidate. So at that point, they don't have one.
Okay.
In the council, with municipalities that had elected a law enforcement candidate. And before that, just to I forgot to mention it, I remove all municipalities that had, at that point, a sitting law enforcement candidate. So what we see here is a different diff when you have when you actually have someone getting elected.
Okay, and those that have a vereador with a law enforcement background could have more than one.
So for robustness checks, check, I removed those. I also run the same estimations with when that happened, and there are actually very few that elect two of them. And the other thing is that I also remove municipalities that had a winning and the losing candidate at the same election.
Okay.
Okay. So here is the results of the regression discontinuity design in the difference of the homicide rates when we look at the rate of homicides for every 100,000 residents in a municipality. And what we see here is that there's a very substantively large effect, meaning that when a municipality ends up electing one of these law enforcement candidates, we have an increase of 20 deaths per homicides, actually, per 100,000 residents. I think at some point I looked at Argentina, and I think it's around 7 or 8 per 100,000. In Brazil is around 25, 30. So what it means is that when one of these guys are elected, there's a doubling in the number of homicides in the municipality. Just to explain a little bit, this plot here is, I run several different local linear models of regression discontinuity designs, from the most restrictive, so the most likely to be free from bias, to a larger bandwidth incrementally. So these estimations over here are the ones that have potentially less bias. And as we move on to the right, we see ever more increasing number of municipalities and potentially we're trading off bias for precision. Okay. So there are some, I also do non-parametric estimations. I have a placebo using the previous period. And just to go a little more on the robustness of the result, if I employ different polynomials, the results are actually larger. If I do a small study group, so this is, I look at incrementally when we are adding one municipality over a very small bandwidth, we see that the results appear to be showing off very close to the cutoff. So these are probably the results that resemble more a randomized experiment, or as if random, some of our advisors would say. And so this seems to be very solid results. And when I try to look at different profiles of the victims, what I find is that there is no noticeable effect among white men. I only see an increase, in a very large increase, in the homicides among white men. I see that I'm going to have to be a little faster. So car robbery. So I also look at crime statistics, and there isn't a lot of precision in these estimates. So there's some suggestion that crimes go down when these guys are elected. Sorry, this is car robberies. There's no effect on sexual assault. And there's also there's no effect for thefts. There's some indication that they spend more of the municipal budget in security when these guys are elected, but these are only 10% of the total budget for public security in a municipality. So, sorry, I lost a little bit of track of time, so I'm going to go a little faster now. So in Brazil, what could explain these results is that there is some politicians that actually campaign program that when they are going to be elected, they're going to get rid of the undesirables, right? So there's clear indication that some of these police officers, they really want to go down and kill a lot of what they call the bandits. And however, what I see is that the number of police killings is unchanged when these guys win. And also, I don't see a lot of police officers getting killed when these police officers getting killed when these guys are elected. So there's no indication that there's more police killings, and there's no indication that there's some confrontation between the state and bandits at the local level. What I see is that first, so these are two important results. The first is that, as I showed in the spreadsheet before, there are some law enforcement that run for office, but they don't actually propagandize that there are law enforcement candidates, and there's no effect for these candidates. The effect only appears for those candidates that are actually using ballot names to remind people that they are from law enforcement. And I have to use this for non-parametric just because the sample size is small. But the effects only appear for candidates that are from the police and not from the army. And this is a clear indication that there has to be a direct connection between these candidates and the local level law enforcement, policing. So I'll be happy to answer any of your doubts in the Q&A. Let me just go through the results, the final results. So I try to look at the favoritism when through a spatial analysis. So I web scrape all the police reports in the state of São Paulo, where I can get the address, and through Google API, I can actually pin down the map where these crimes occur, of violence. So these are, each cross here is in a municipality in São Paulo, my hometown. We see that there's, each of these cross represents a homicide, and each of these dots over here represent a polling station in Brazil, or in this municipality specifically. And these are like 1 kilometer radius around this polling station. And what I do is I count the number of occurrences within this 1 kilometer radius. And I see, I try to look at the differences when one of these candidates are elected. And we see, for example, in this map that in this polling station here, there was one homicide, but after the next electoral period, we don't see any homicide here. In this polling station here, we see that there's a large increase in the number of homicides. And this is a polling station that sits in a suburban rich area of this municipality. Meanwhile, this is in a poor neighborhood. And what I'm trying to get through this spatial analysis is whether we can imagine like this, if this is one polling station that voted for law enforcement candidates, whether it's going to be favored by the law enforcement candidate, and we're going to see less events here than we see here. If we imagine this is one of the polling stations that didn't vote for this guy. And just to give you an idea what happens, who votes for these guys. So I separate polling stations to, like like top stations, meaning that those that vote the most for law enforcement candidates, and bottom stations, those that vote the least for law enforcement candidates. And we see that we don't have a lot of information for at the polling station level, but we have the educational profile of voters there. And we see that there's an association with being a polling station that vote for these guys and having more education, meaning they're probably more wealthy And we see a negative association between not voting for these guys and education. So the poor polling stations usually don't vote for these guys. This is, we see that there's the higher the education, the more votes these guys usually receive. It's an association here. And what I'm trying to do here then is to see what happens when there's law enforcement candidates in the, I want to see in the vicinity of a police station that did not vote for this guy, what happens. I also do that for police stations that voted for this guy, and the results mirror each other. I'm going to go show you because we don't have much time. So basically what I see is that for when we're looking at car robberies, we see that at the bottom stations, so the stations that did not vote for law enforcement candidates, we see an increase in the number of car robberies. And when we look at violence, we see an increase in violence near polling stations that did not vote for law enforcement candidates. And if I look at a placebo, so if I look at past outcomes, we don't see any effect. So it seems that there is an indication that of political favoritism. I didn't show the top polling stations, but the top polling stations, we see the reverse signal. So we see less crime and less violence. Okay. So sorry, I had to rush a little bit, but in the conclusion, what we see is that law enforcement candidates, they do follow through their campaign promises, which leads to political favoritism, and that favoritism leads to more violence. It's not a story about state weakness, so we see an increase in violence, not because there's a direct confrontation between criminals and the state, and also it's not that there's social cleansing. It's not that these police officers go killing vulnerable youth, or that they make their colleagues go kill these people, because we don't see any effect on it. What it seems to be is that there's a political favoritism. And in a different project, what I see is that removing police from vulnerable people is very dangerous. So when we look at, for example, when there are police strikes, we see the number of homicides increase a lot. So I guess the results point to two directions, right? Mixing politics with police is dangerous because police is still very somewhat important to maintain crime level down through in the most vulnerable neighborhoods. Well, sorry, I had to rush. Well, thank you, and I'm eager to hear you any comments you might have.
Thank you, Lucas. I think I forgot to mention that Lucas is an assistant professor at Insper, and well, he has well been there for at least 2 or 3 years now. So I don't know if we have questions. If people want to raise their hands, and I'll pass them. You can open the mic and ask questions. I see Pedro. Pedro, if you want to take it first.
I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you guys here.
Yeah, I have a question on it's mostly just to understand it better. Is the focus, like the main focus of the study, like there's a bigger focus on the municipalities and like the difference in the voting and what that leads to, or what that shows maybe of the place, rather than the politicians themselves, right? I'm just trying to see if I got it right. Like the focus is not on the politicians necessarily, but rather on the places they are voted in or not.
Right, exactly. So I want to understand. I don't want to understand, to be exact, why these politicians run for office, right? I'm looking at the next stage. Like they already decided to run for office, and what happens after that? I do have some on the appendix of this project. Well, I have some. I actually analyze what kind of candidates they are, but I'm not. I at this point I only seeing what happens after they decide to run for office.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a few questions, but I don't know if if anyone wants to go first. If not, I'll start bombing Lucas with questions. Okay, so let me just maybe ask or make you a few comments and then probably ask a question too. So I think what you show is super interesting, which is we have these districts that are composed mostly of. Correct me if I misunderstood any part of the argument, but these districts that are composed mostly of wealthy voters that vote for these candidates, and then we see violence against poor people going up by a lot, and so that's a very troubling situation and a very important finding. I want to know more about this. Is it especially about the mechanism that explains this rise in deaths of non-white people? So one is, do you yes, maybe so the mechanism seems to be that there's more police presence of local police presence in this place, and that drives violence up. But it is quite unclear still why that would be the case. Is that especially since we don't see more police killings? So is it that police are just like are ruining the business for criminals, and so now they have to engage in more violence to make ends meet in the criminal organization, or or what? Because I think that you started by talking about Mexico and the rising violence in Mexico, but then in those places you see confrontation with organized crime. And this doesn't seem to be the case in your story. So, or maybe it is, so maybe exploring, concentration of, if this concentrates in places where gangs are operating, the Comando Vermelho, or, the Frenchy do Norte, I don't know. I know some states in Brazil are completely taken by cartels, while others we see no presence. So I'll just, I'll ask more questions later.
Thank you, Edmund. So, I mean, this is really the big challenge of this project, to understand exactly what is happening, because, for example, I don't have any direct measure of police presence. I have to go around to see if I can find, I look at the outcome of crime and violence to get some sense of it. And another thing that to put into perspective, like the median size of municipality in Brazil is 30,000 residents. So if there's one marginal killing in these municipalities, we're going to see a spike, right? So it's not that we're going to be seeing a turf war. Actually, we don't have to see a turf war. If there is one or two or three more killings in these municipalities in the period that I'm analyzing, we're going to see this spike. And if this is diluted over the whole period of 3 years, it's not that it's gonna raise an alarm bell, right? So it's why these guys are getting killed. I can't answer that precisely. What I look at is that usually these are all killings through firearms. So they're all killed by shootings. All the effects are shootings, and they're young. So the fact that we don't get killings among women, for example, it points out that it's not accidents, or it's not that they're random killings. It seems that there's some purpose in their killings. But like, as I mentioned, like, we can't compare these municipalities to Mexico or communities in Rio. It's mostly like local disputes that are not really consequential in the terms of grand scheme of things. There's some anthropological studies that look at that. And in these anthropological studies, what we see is that when the police is not present anymore in a community, we see that there is a sense of that any crime I commit and any homicide that happens there will not be investigated. And finally, the other thing that I have, and this is in another project, I try to actually measure what causes when the police withdraws from the streets. So I have this event study where I look what happens when there's a police strike, and when actually the police go back to the barracks or the departments, and then go out in the streets. And we see that in the week after the strike is the strike starts, we see a huge spike in violence. So it seems that people really respond to the lack of police. And so basically, it's a return of the natural state at some point. But what we see in this project is that this return of the natural state takes a longer time.
Thank you, Lucas. That's super interesting. I don't know if we have more questions or comments.
Hey, yeah, I raised my hand, but I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah. So hey, Lucas, great presentation.
Thank you.
Really interesting work. Really well done. My question was about a certain part of your presentation. If I understood and remember correctly, you compared those candidates that used that sort of campaigned explicitly on their connection to law enforcement with those law enforcement candidates that didn't include that in their ballot name, and found that there was no effect among those who did not use. Yeah. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about why because if the mechanism you propose has to do with their sort of connections with local police departments and their ability to influence the behavior of police once they're elected, really their campaign really has, the way they campaign really has no part in that story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why we wouldn't see the same effect under your sort of theoretical framework when they don't campaign with their police title.
Right. So thank you for this question, and I'm sorry if this wasn't clear when I was presenting. So part of the argument is that these candidates, they campaign on program, right? And if they campaign on program, when elected, oh, no, change here. They have to try to follow up on their promise. And there are these two groups of candidates, those that use the ballot name and try to mobilize voters on program of law and order. And those just happen to be from the police, but are running for office. These that are running for office, not using the programmatic appeal of their professions, they do not necessarily have to follow up on a promise that they didn't make. So if they have to favor their constituency, they have to favor their constituency some other way, or they can even try to do the law enforcement routine, but they didn't campaign on it. So I don't expect them to actually try to implement or to make changes on public security because they did not run on that banner. Meanwhile, the other ones, they did run on the banner, and they're going to be accountable for what they do at that specific front. So that's why I argue that we should see an effect only for the group that use a ballot name as a law enforcement mandate.
Thank you, Lucas. That's interesting. I don't know if anyone else has questions. I have, as I said, I'm going to send you an email after this because I have a lot. But do you think that? So I'll ask one more. So if you can tell us a little bit more about differences between state level and federal level police forces. So, Policía Rodoviaria, if you would expect, similar effects or if you have, people from the federal bureaucracy running for office and also trying to do the same thing as these local policemen and women.
So I actually don't find a single federal agent that runs for office, at least not at the local level. And so this is tricky because I think a federal, so there are two police branches. There are national branches in Brazil, the Polícia Federal, which carry out interstate investigations and arrests and all that, and the highway patrol, right? Like those that only go through the patrol the highways. And so the numbers for these two types of so the number of federal police and the number of police patrols in the highway patrols are like 1/10 or 1/20th of the number of actual Polícia Civil or Polícia Militar. So I wouldn't be able to test them directly. But to answer your question, you asked if what I would expect that they would, if they had an effect, it will be through a larger territory, so it will be really hard to pick up any effect. But the mechanism is still there. Maybe they will still favor their constituency, right? And but it will be really hard empirically to assess it. But as in other domains of politics, they would very likely would try to favor their constituency and reallocate resources.
Yeah, I don't, or at least, yeah. Let me put this question in a different way, which is like, you know, is any type of increasing police activity will cause this, or do you have a sense that we can get lower crime and lower homicides if we could do, you know, better policing, and if you feel that any federal agency is better equipped to do that?
So the federal police, I don't think they would affect levels of crime and violence, simply because they are not dealing with that. They usually deal with financial and corruption and those. I mean, obviously there might be some effect of corruption on crime, but that direct will be very indirect. Regarding the police, the highway patrol, I think that might actually have an effect. If you think about, like, there's this Melissa Dell paper where she traces the routes for drug trafficking, and this highway patrols, if they are now patrolling a specific portion of the highway, there might be some diversion of the drug trafficking routes. So they would go to a different place, and in those different places would have more crime. But overall, I think that a more, I guess, especially where the drug trafficking organizations are not, either there's some criminal governance going on, I think more police can actually be beneficial, or at least a long-standing police force in poorer areas can actually improve the numbers of public security, because they don't have a competition with crime, or well, with criminal governance providing goods to people, and there's some connection between the populace and the criminal gangs.
Okay, thank you, Lucas. This was super interesting. This is very promising work. I'm sure it's gonna, you know, get better and better, and we'll see it, you know, published soon, hopefully.